Before we begin, please click the like button and comment "Amen" to help my channel. I really appreciate it.
My wife and I were the highest bidders for a serial killer's home at an auction. I can't believe what we found. For some, retirement is a long-awaited dream. A chance to finally put their careers behind them and focus on anything but the job they toiled away at for decades. But for me, retirement had always been something I'd dreaded. A ticking clock that was rapidly approaching, day by day. A deadline to solve a decade-old cold case, to catch the serial killer responsible for it, and finally bring closure to the mystery. In the end, I wasn't able to solve the case in time, lacking enough evidence to pin it on its number one and only suspect, Milton Astor, who just so happened to die of old age 1 month before the very retirement date that I had long promised my wife, Ada. So, the day after my retirement party, I did what any right-minded ex-detective would do and went to the auction for the suspected serial killer's estate. Going once, going twice, sold to Mr. McKenna. The auctioneer called out, to the horror of my wife, who knew exactly what I was undoubtedly up to. "Are you out of your mind?" Ada asked. "You have to be in my line of work," I explained. "Luckily, it's not your line of work anymore. You know, retirement is supposed to be about forgetting your work and finding new hobbies. This will be something of a new hobby." "New? You've been hunting this guy for nearly a decade now, Theodore. It's time to let it go." "I will, after we move in and finally put this case to rest." "We? You expect me to move in there with you?" A month later, my wife and I moved into the home with just a couple of bags. 'Cause the thing is, with no will or beneficiaries and an unpaid mortgage, not only was Milton Astor's house put up for auction, but it came fully furnished. Furniture, personal possessions, you name it. Everything down to the kitchen sink, literally. And when we finally got the keys and stepped inside, we discovered exactly what you'd expect to find inside a suspected serial killer's home. Cat piss on the rugs, rotten food in the fridge, and of course, a heaping mound of junk. But the truth is, I wasn't interested in Milton Astor's personal belongings. No. If my suspicions were correct, there was something much more important inside the house. More accurately, under the house. The labyrinth. You see, back in the day, whenever the serial killer, or so we called him, had kidnapped a victim, he only ever left behind one cryptic symbol. A maze. A detail which we at the police department kept under wraps until a proper connection could be found. For all anyone else knew, any disappearances over the years were disparate and unrelated. But we knew the truth. We knew that somewhere out there was a serial killer. And in no time at all, I had started referring to him internally at the police department as the Minotaur. Convinced that the maze symbol implied that the killer was burying his victims inside some sort of maze-like structure, I became obsessed with finding one. All I had to do was locate the Minotaur's labyrinth. So when Milton Astor became our number one suspect, we raided his home multiple times, always combing his basement for any sign of an entrance to an underground lair. Each time, to no avail. But now that I lived in that very home, I had a second chance. To scour the suspected serial killer's basement for the entrance to the labyrinth that my former self could never find. The basement was disgusting and revolting and exhausting to go through, but I somehow found the process exhilarating. And so I, along with Ada, who begrudgingly lended a hand, began rummaging through the suspected serial killer's cellar, searching for any sign of an entrance to what I was convinced was a labyrinth. But after searching and searching for weeks on end, I eventually resolved to give up. "You were right. I just have to come to terms with it," I said, as I sat beside Ada on the house's rear deck, looking out at the backyard and wallowing in defeat. "No," Ada replied. "We have to keep going." Normally, I would have been surprised to hear my wife make such a statement. But in the weeks that we'd spent searching the house, she had somehow become even more obsessed with the mystery than me, and was determined to solve it. "But where?" I asked. That's when my wife stood up and looked out at the Minotaur's backyard, squinting. "That patch of grass out there, in the center of the lawn, looks different than the rest." I nearly fell out of my seat, trying to hop up to take a look. The backyard, I thought to myself. We had always been so obsessed with his basement that we completely overlooked what had been staring us in the face the whole time. A few minutes later, Ada rolled up a square patch of artificial turf in the center of the backyard, revealing a wooden hatch that opened into the ground. I looked at Ada with wide eyes. In 1 month's time, she had done what I couldn't do in 10 years. Then a look of horror washed over my face as I realized what we had actually unearthed. She had found the Minotaur's labyrinth. A few minutes later, we were standing in the entrance of what was clearly a man-made underground cavern, having opened the hatch and descended down a pair of rickety wooden stairs. Before us, a cramped, claustrophobic tunnel led off into darkness. "Should we call the police?" Ada asked, shaking nervously. "Not yet," I replied, holding a flashlight in one shaking hand and a revolver in the other. I was, after all, a retired policeman myself. I shined the light up ahead. Sure enough, about 20 feet away, the passage split in two, leaving us with two choices: left and right. "It is a fucking maze," I clarified. "Well, you were right about that," my wife commended me. "So which is it?" I asked her. "Left or right?" "I'm gonna have to go with," she began, pulling a coin from her pocket, tossing it in the air and letting it fall to the dirt. "Left." Left it is. Once we began to explore the maze, I immediately realized that terrifying things likely awaited us inside, and warned my wife. But when we reached the end of the left passage and arrived at a dead end, it became immediately apparent that what awaited us was far more terrifying than I had even suspected. There, at the end of the tunnel, illuminated by nothing but my flashlight and tied to an old rocking chair, sat one of the serial killer's victims. Still alive, an IV protruding from his arm and leading to a medical bag that was mounted on the wall, his eyes squinting in the glare of the flashlight. "What the fuck?" I whispered to my wife. "They're all down here, and they're all still alive." Chills ran down my spine as I placed my gun in my belt, took Ada by the hand, and rushed over to help the sickly man. "Are you okay?" Ada asked him. "Who did this to you?" I added. But the man was much too weak to utter a reply. "Don't worry, we'll get you out of here," I said, reasoning that, given his proximity to the hatch, we should free him and bring him up to the house before continuing any further into the labyrinth. "This may sting a little," Ada said to the man, as she signaled me to rip the IV bag from the wall. But as soon as I did, we heard a peculiar sound. Thwack. "Wait!" I began. "Was that?" Ada replied, as we both realized that removing the sickly man's IV bag had triggered the hatch to close from above. I wandered back to the maze's entrance, and sure enough, as I shone my flashlight on the hatch, saw that it had closed, and attempting to open it, found it locked from the inside. When I got back to Ada, she could immediately tell by my body language that we were in trouble. "Locked?" she asked. "Locked," I replied. A few minutes later, we once again found ourselves venturing into the darkness, this time down the right passage, left with no other choice but to finish what we started. The sickly man hobbling along with us, still too weak to let out a word. It wasn't long before we reached another fork in the road, so to speak, and we were forced to make yet another choice. Left or right. But rather than flip a coin, our decision was made easy as we began to hear a noise emanating from the right passage as it grew louder and louder and louder until we could hear whatever it was, grunting and howling as its seemingly enormous body could be heard charging closer and closer and closer. The sound of it alone sent my body into fight or flight. As adrenaline began to course through my body, my heart rate spiked, and my breath grew short. "What the fuck is that sound?" I whispered to Ada. "Whatever it is, thanks to the trap, it knows we're here now," my wife whispered back. "We've got to run," I called out, as I signaled for both Ada and the sickly man to follow me down the left passage. My wife heeded my call, but the sickly man, well, the poor sickly man didn't stand a chance, as a massive hulking monstrosity of a man, his face shrouded in darkness, came barreling around the corner, sword in hand. Yes, an actual fucking sword, its blade worn, its metal rusted, and proceeded to hack the man to pieces as Ada and I watched on in horror, trying to make sense of what was going on and what the fuck that thing could possibly be. That's when, as the giant dropped what was left of the sickly man's body to the ground, it turned and looked at us. "Run!" I called out to Ada as I pointed to the left passage. My wife took off into the darkness as I caught one last glance at the monster and its weapon, and followed Ada deeper into the labyrinth. "Why didn't you shoot it?" my wife asked, referring to the monstrous figure we had just seen hack one of the serial killer's victims to pieces before we darted off deeper into the maze he had built for them. I simply hung my head in shame as I held out the empty chamber of my revolver for her to see. "But why?" she asked. "Isn't the point of having a gun so that you can use it when needed?" "Ada, when the grandkids come over, do you really want that thing to be loaded?" "You lock it up!" she yelled, losing her temper, something she rarely did, before calming herself down. "I'm sorry, but it didn't bother me. After all, we were in an extraneous situation, locked inside a labyrinth built underneath the serial killer's home that we had just bought in an auction. A serial killer that I had spent my entire career trying to find, and only in retirement, with the help of my wife, was I finally able to. "So what now?" Ada asked nervously, as we stood there in the dark, unsure of what direction to go or what passage to take. "We just keep going, like you said earlier, until we find our way out of this place." My wife, left with no other choice, reluctantly agreed. And so, we both set off into the unknown, our only guiding light that of the flashlight I'd had the foresight to bring with me. But before we could make it very far, we once again found ourselves arriving at a dead end, where yet another sickly victim of the serial killer was tied up. Once again, with an IV in their arm. "You were right," Ava said. "They're all alive down here." Not long after that, we found another, and then another, and then another. How many people had disappeared again? My wife asked, surely wondering how many more victims we might find down there. Over the years, 7 men and 7 women, I replied. I think one version of the myth is like that. 7 men and 7 women. The myth of the Minotaur, like you had nicknamed him? I suddenly froze in horror as I realized how literal the analogy really was. Sure, after the serial killer had carved mazes into the last whereabouts of his victims, I had suspected he was keeping them in a labyrinth and had always jokingly referred to him as the Minotaur. But now that we had found a literal monster in the maze, and my wife had pointed out that 7 men and 7 women had disappeared, it had become more clear than ever that its architect was not the Minotaur, but King Minos, and the labyrinth was not a happy accident, but some sort of fucked up immersive homage to that very myth. But why? I asked, after sharing my thoughts with my wife. Why would he go into such detail? Perhaps to better understand it, you have to go back to the myth itself. Why did Minos create the labyrinth in the first place? I thought about it for a minute, before it all came back to me. Because his son, Androgeus, was killed by the Athenians. So as a punishment, he forced Athenian men and women to be sacrificed to the Minotaur. Did Milton Astor have a son? What are you getting at? I asked. Just answer the question, Ada insisted. I thought about it for a moment. No, I mean, yes, but he died, along with his wife. Well, there you have it. Have it. The Minotaur is his son. But how? I don't know how or why, but I just have a feeling. I just don't understand, I said, trying to rack my brain around how Milton Astor's son could still be alive, and why he was running around in an underground maze. But before I could get too lost in thought, we were interrupted by the very sound we had heard earlier, just before the monster had stormed into our passage and hacked the first victim to pieces. Suddenly, the entire structure rattled, and the earth below our feet shook as the sounds of growling, huffing, and stomping could be heard growing closer, and closer, and closer, until the giant man came barreling around the corner of the maze, sword in hand, and howled. It cried out as I shone my flashlight light into his eyes and was finally able to see the monster's head. It was that of a man's, covered in a burlap sack, with holes cut out for eyes and mouth, with horns seemingly drilled into his head. "What the fuck?" I cried out, as Ada took a step back and screamed. "That's the fucking Minotaur!" she called out, as she put her arm around the 3 new victims we'd found and attempted to back them away. The giant screamed as it raised its sword above its head. But just then, in that very moment, my flashlight's battery died, and the entirety of the passage went dark. Not knowing what else to do, and fearing that the Minotaur would strike at any moment, I reached out into the darkness, took Ada by the hand, and ran in the opposite direction of the monster. "But the victims," Ada called out. "Just run," I urged her, as we darted away down the tunnel, to the sound of the poor victims being torn apart. A good distance later, we finally stopped to catch our breath and held each other, shaking, in the pitch-black dark of the labyrinth. All was quiet, except the heavy inhales and exhales of our exhausted panting, and what I swear was the sound of both our beating hearts, still racing from the encounter and the escape that followed. And as we both stood there in the darkness, terrified, and fearing that there was no end in sight, the most curious of things happened. I saw the faintest glimmer of light far away into the distance. "Ada," I said, "look." She turned and saw what I saw. But what could it be? It doesn't look like daylight. A few minutes later, after following the tunnel to the source of the light, we arrived at the center of the maze we found. Of all things, a living room. A small living room, but a living room no less, with a refrigerator and 2 beds. And there, sitting in the center of the room, rocking back and forth in a rocking chair, was an old woman, her hair white, her hands wrinkled, and her eyes squinting. "Come, Bobby, it's dinner time," she asked, clearly mistaking us for someone else, until Ada and I both took a step closer, and she realized we weren't who she thought we were. "Oh, you're not Bobby," she said, correcting herself. "Then who are you? No one else is supposed to be down here." "Is Bobby your son, ma'am?" I asked. "Yes." "Is he the one with the sword, dressed like a bull?" "Yes." "Can I just ask, why?" That's when the old woman signaled us to sit down in a couple chairs beside her and began to tell us the story of her son and the labyrinth. As a boy, Bobby was always fond of Greek myths. His favorite was the story of the Minotaur. He'd always run around, pretending to be the Minotaur in the maze. But after the accident, he couldn't separate reality from fantasy, and the real Bobby never returned. All that was left was the Minotaur. But why the victims? Why do you keep people down here? Because his father, Milton Astor, is your husband? Yes. He wanted his son to be happy, so he created this place for him. Labyrinth, the sacrificed Athenians and all. "Where are the others?" Ada asked. "We only found 4 people down there." "Oh, they're gone." "Gone?" I asked. But before she could answer, suddenly the monster himself came storming down the passage. Closer, and closer, and closer. But when he arrived at the living room and saw his mother, the Minotaur, or should I say Bobby, simply relaxed his composure and took a seat at a nearby table where a plate and silverware had been waiting. "Where have you been? It's dinner time," his mother said as she walked over to the refrigerator. But what we didn't expect was what she removed from it. A plastic bag full of body parts, clearly that of Milton Astor's former victims. And what she would do with them as she proceeded to pour the body parts onto Bobby's plate, and he proceeded to feast on them. Ada's eyes grew wide in horror as I resisted the urge to throw up. But suddenly, in that moment, while the Minotaur and his mother were distracted, I spotted the key to the trap door at the entrance of the labyrinth, and taking Ada by the hand, seized the opportunity, stole the keys, and ran off, back into the dark tunnels of the maze, before the monster or the old woman had a chance to react. Not long after, the hatch opened, and we emerged from the labyrinth, our eyes squinting as they adjusted to the daylight before immediately calling my former colleagues at the police department. And in a matter of hours, they had raided the maze with guns drawn, swept the entirety of the structure, and detained the Minotaur and his mother. But unlike the myth, neither my wife and I or the cops were ever able to save any of the victims. So, in keeping with the tradition of not startling the townspeople, the police kept the arrests and what had happened under Milton Astor's house under wraps, leaving the cold cases as just that. And while I didn't agree with that decision, I accepted that I was retired and it wasn't my decision to make. All I could do was feel a sense of relief that I was right about Milton Astor being the serial killer behind the disappearances, and knowing that he wasn't out there anymore. When the cops finally left us, to what was now a home with little purpose, my wife simply asked me, "We don't have to keep living here, do we?" To which I replied, "Definitely not." In no time, we had bought a new home and had sold Milton Astor's house. And now, whenever I sit on the deck behind my house, looking out at my backyard, I wonder if the people that bought the last house will ever discover the Minotaur's labyrinth in its backyard. Aha! You survived the story. Think you can handle how deep, dark, and disturbing the rabbit hole goes? Click on the playlist and let me know in the comments where your breaking point is.